It seems kind of mad that we're here already, but this is the Moto G10. And Moto has consistently given us great value, reliable smartphones that don't cost a lot of money in the G series. But for 2021, the naming and the numbering system has completely changed. So much so that maybe the G10 isn't just the default choice anymore. Still, the G10 is an affordable phone in a series of phones that's starting to look a little bit crowded, but is it the one that you should get? Or should you perhaps pay a little bit extra money and get the G30 instead? I'm Cam Bunton from Pocket-lint, and this is our review, and we'll hopefully find out by the end. Now, Moto G design has never been all that fancy or premium, and that makes sense. It's a budget phone, and lots of corners need cutting to get it down to the right price. This year, the G10 has taken on something of an unusual finish with its ribbed back panel. That wave pattern you see isn't just a visual thing, it actually has texture too. You can feel them. It was a little weird to begin with, but the texture has its merits. It definitely makes it feel less slippery and less likely to just fall off random surfaces like a sofa or a bookshelf. And that's not the only practical design choice made here either. Unlike some more expensive phones, the G10 is equipped with pretty much everything you could need, just to make it as little of a hindrance as possible. So that means you get a 3.5mm headphone port at the top for plugging in your hands-free kit, or wired headphones. You also get a micro SD card slot for expanding storage, but that takes up one of the two SIM card slots. You might find that useful if you like to keep all your files and media stored offline and swap them easily between devices when you eventually upgrade again. And if you have the 64GB phone model, you may just find you need that external storage anyway. So what else is there? Well, you'll find 3 buttons on the right side. One is the usual power button, and there's the volume rocker switch, but then curiously, there's also an additional button which, when pressed, will launch Google Assistant. And that's fine, but we can't imagine that loads of people will use that all the time. As for the fingerprint sensor on the back, usually we laud the appearance of physical scanners because they're fast and reliable. But that's not the case with this one. Most times it would take 2 to 3 goes before a successful scan, meaning it was often quicker just to punch in the PIN code instead. The front is pretty standard too, with its relatively skinny bezel up the sides and the dewdrop style notch at the top of the display, barely cutting into the available screen real estate. And while there's only one loudspeaker placed on the bottom edge, the speaker grill is long enough that we didn't find we ever really completely blocked it, whether we were holding it in landscape or in portrait. Now onto the display, and as with most affordable budget phones, this one has an HD resolution IPS panel. It's a pretty long ratio and it features a resolution of 720 by 1600. Obviously that means it's not super sharp, but it's adequate for daily use and won't leave you squinting indoors. In fact, it's pleasant enough when inside and watching movies, gaming and browsing the web. It's not the most vivid panel around. In fact, dynamic range does suffer a tad on this affordable handset, but that's almost to be expected from an LCD screen on a cheap smartphone. The one place we did notice it struggled the most was outside in daylight. Trying to frame shots with the camera to shoot in sunlight was almost impossible. We could barely see what was on the screen, even with the brightness cranked right up. And as for software, well, that's the usual Moto style of having an almost stock-like Android experience with a few extra Moto touches thrown in for good measure. That means you get all of Google's default apps, and you get fun gestures like swiping down on the fingerprint sensor to get to your notifications, or a chopping motion to switch on the flashlight. Now, if what you're after in a smartphone primarily is really good battery life, then this is where the Moto G10 has you covered. We're happy to report that the G10 delivers that in buckets. Even in a phone with a high-end flagship processor and a top-of-the-line display, a 5000 mAh capacity battery would be generous. So stick it in a phone with a low power chip and only 720p resolution screen, and you get one of the longest lasting phones on the planet. In testing, we'd often get to the end of a second day and still have some juice left over, even after using it for testing the camera and playing a couple of hours of games each day. For most people, we think this is a genuine 2-day phone. You'll never have to worry about it dying during the day if you've taken it off charge in the morning. Being 5000 mAh does mean charging times are a little slow, especially with the charging speeds maxing out at 10 watts. So it's definitely one to plug in at night while you sleep. Although the fact you only have to do that every other night kind of negates that problem. As for general performance, this is where it slips up against its slightly more expensive sibling, the G30. The Snapdragon 400 series processor inside isn't unusable, but it does feel quite slow and laggy a lot of the time. Loading web pages or backing up photos to Google Photos seems to take longer than it should, while animations in the general interface appear quite stuttery. In fact, Google Photos did on a couple of occasions just hang and crash and wouldn't respond, and fail to upload our photos. The G30 just seems more reliable in day-to-day in that regard, which is why we'd recommend that over this phone. It's not that the G30 is super smooth and fast all the time, it just didn't leave us hanging quite as much as the G10 did. Still, for most tasks the G10 is fine, if unremarkable. It'll play all your games and load all your apps fine, just a little bit slowly than you might like. As for camera quality, the quad system is led by a 48 megapixel primary camera, and that's joined by an 8 megapixel ultrawide and low resolution depth and macro sensors. Stick to the main sensor and you'll be mostly fine. In good daylight your pictures will be sharp, colourful and feature decent depth. It's not flagship level, naturally, but it's good enough for social media. The ultra-wide is just okay. It struggles to focus a lot and often leaves colours looking unnatural, completely different to the main sensor. While the macro lens can be useful for close-ups at times, but results are not consistent. And being quite a low resolution sensor means that details aren't that great either. Yet another case of a budget phone that has more cameras than it knows what to do with. So on the whole then, the G10 might be the first entry-level Moto G we don't unequivocally recommend as an easy go buy it, because the G30 exists, and it is a better phone and it doesn't cost that much more. There's nothing especially wrong with the G10, and in fact the battery life, software and practical design make it more than good enough for most people. But there's the G30 to consider. Our experience with that was better, especially when it comes down to daily performance, so if you can, we'd recommend stumping up the extra money and getting the G30 instead. I'm Big Cam, I'm at Cam Bunton on social media. You can follow me, ask me any questions, use the comment section down below, and if you like this video, please do leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and make sure you hit that little bell to make sure you don't miss any more. And I'll see you again in the next one. Bye for now.